Some people move through the world with a quiet, persistent feeling that they are somehow too much for the people around them, too intense, too emotional, too enthusiastic about things other people seem unbothered by. And at some point, it may be in childhood, maybe in a relationship, maybe somewhere in between, they heard it out loud. You're a lot. Maybe it came from a parent, a teacher, a partner, explaining why things weren't working. Maybe it was never said directly, just implied in the way a room shifted when they walked in, the way someone's eyes went flat when they started talking about something they cared about, the way their enthusiasm was quietly treated like a character flaw. And if any of that sounds familiar, if you've ever pre-apologized for being excited or left a conversation replaying everything you said, wondering if you'd been too much, this isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign of something very specific going on psychologically. And once you understand it, a lot of things start to make sense. The people who carry this experience don't usually describe themselves as passionate or deep feeling. They describe themselves as exhausting, as difficult, as someone others eventually need a break from. They've absorbed the feedback so completely that they deliver the verdict on themselves before anyone else gets the chance. They preemptively shrink. They add a self-deprecating disclaimer before sharing something they're excited about, just to soften the landing in case the other person isn't interested. They monitor the faces of people around them for the first flicker of overwhelm. They leave gatherings early, not because they're tired, but because they're afraid of overstaying their welcome. They replay conversations afterward, tallying up the moments they might have said too much, taken up too much space, felt too visibly. Most people who experience this have done it so long that it no longer feels like a strategy. It just feels like who they are. To understand where this pattern comes from, you have to go back to early childhood, not in a vague, general sense, but to something quite specific that researchers have spent decades tracing. Some children are simply born with a nervous system that responds more intensely to the world around them. This isn't a disorder or a flaw, it's a natural variation. Researchers have found that roughly 15 to 20% of children show this kind of heightened responsiveness. They're startled more easily. They feel emotional shifts more acutely. They process what's happening around them more thoroughly than their peers. In the right environment, this goes almost unnoticed, except as a positive. In the wrong one, it becomes the beginning of a very long story. Picture a child who cries at a piece of music during a school assembly, or who becomes visibly overwhelmed in a loud, crowded room while everyone else seems fine, or who can't stop asking questions about something that struck them as unfair long after everyone else has moved on. These children aren't being dramatic. Their experience is genuinely more intense than what's happening inside the kids around them. And if the adults in their lives don't have a framework for understanding that, if they see the behavior without understanding the wiring behind it, the message that gets sent is almost inevitable. Something about you is too much for this situation. The child doesn't hear. Your nervous system processes things more deeply, and not every environment is built for that. The child hears, "You are wrong. You are excessive. You are a problem to be managed." And here is where the pattern really takes hold. Children who receive that message repeatedly don't stop having big emotions. They build elaborate internal systems for hiding them. They learn to compress what they feel down to an acceptable size before it ever reaches the surface. They become experts at reading the room, not for enjoyment, but as a form of protection, monitoring, calibrating, deciding dozens of times a day which version of their actual reaction is safe to share and which has to disappear. The exhaustion this produces is very specific. It's not the exhaustion of doing too much. It's the exhaustion of managing yourself, of running a quiet internal audit that never quite switches off. And it shapes relationships in a particular way. Many people in this category become unusually skilled at attunement, at sensing what others need and offering it. But the exchange tends to be lopsided. Giving attunement comes naturally. Receiving it is harder. Being genuinely seen, not tolerated, not quietly managed, but actually seen, can feel disorienting because somewhere in the background they're always waiting for the moment when the full version of them becomes too much for the other person to hold. So they reveal themselves gradually, in small installments, testing the temperature before they let more of themselves into a relationship. It's not deception. It's a long-practiced form of damage control. There's also something worth noticing about a pattern many people in this category recognize immediately. When they share something they care deeply about and the other person responds with mild interest, or worse, changes the subject, there's a flash of something. Not quite embarrassment, more like confirmation, as if the lukewarm response is evidence of the thing they always suspected, that the depth of what they feel is out of proportion to what the moment called for. So they make a small internal note, dial it back next time. Don't bring that up again, and gradually the list of things they feel safe to share in full gets shorter. Now here's the part that almost never gets examined, and what matters most. The trait itself was never the problem. What happened was a mismatch between a nervous system calibrated to feel and process things deeply, and environments that weren't built to accommodate it. Those two things got collapsed into a single verdict. The environment's difficulty with the trait became evidence that the trait was flawed. But those are not the same thing. Think about what that trait actually produces when it lands somewhere that can hold it. People who feel things intensely also tend to think with unusual precision. They notice what's wrong before others do. They bring real urgency to problems that deserve it. They're often exceptional in work that requires emotional intelligence, whether that's medicine, teaching, creative fields, leadership, or any situation where genuinely understanding another person matters. The same sensitivity that made them too much at a family dinner table makes them remarkable in contexts where depth is valued rather than penalized. Research on emotional intensity consistently finds something that surprises people. Those who feel things more strongly are not just more vulnerable to suffering, they're also more prone to awe, to genuine connection, to the kind of meaning-making that makes a life feel like it actually happened. The signal is louder, but the signal is real. There's an important distinction here that often gets missed. There's a difference between intensity and instability. Instability means emotions that overwhelm a person's ability to function, that swing without pattern or reason. Intensity is different. It's a high signal level in a nervous system that's actually working correctly. The volume is turned up, but the processing is intact. Often more than intact, often more thorough, more nuanced, more accurate than average. These two things get conflated constantly. And when they do, people who are processing experience deeply and accurately come away believing that the depth itself is the dysfunction. That conclusion is wrong, but it's very hard to unlearn once it's been absorbed. Over years of quietly managing yourself down to an acceptable size, something gradual happens. You get extraordinarily good at it, and somewhere along the way, you lose track of your original shape. The most common description of this isn't quite depression, and it isn't quite anxiety. It's a kind of flatness, a muting. The person who was once described as too much becomes, in their own experience, too little. They've quieted themselves so successfully that they've lost access to the feeling they were trying to contain. This tends to surface in unexpected moments, in a conversation where someone finally listens without flinching and the intensity of being received feels almost too much to tolerate, in a song or a film or a stranger's story that cracks something open without warning, in the recognition, usually somewhere in adulthood, that the version of themselves they've been presenting was built from a long series of quiet surrenders. And what happens when people in this category reach that moment of recognition is worth paying attention to, because they are, by nature, thorough processors. They don't just absorb new information, they build with it. When they finally have the language to describe their own experience, something begins to shift, not immediately, not all at once. But the architecture changes. There's a particular kind of resilience that develops in people who have spent years compressing themselves. Not the resilience of someone who was never hurt. They were. But the resilience of someone who has learned to locate what matters from the inside and hold on to it even when the world hasn't confirmed it yet. Because the self-monitoring was never about weakness. It was a rational response to a specific environment, and rational responses, once the environment changes, can change too. What tends to shift things, sometimes dramatically, is encountering a relationship, a community, or even just a conversation where the full version of them is not just tolerated, but genuinely received, where there's no ceiling on how much they can care or feel or notice, where depth is not treated as a liability. Most people who have carried this experience for a long time have never actually had that. What they've had instead is conditional acceptance. I'll take this much of you, just not that much, which registers emotionally as rejection of the whole, because you can't actually separate the trait from the person who holds it. But when genuine reception happens, even once, even partially, the vigilance begins to ease. Not because the person has changed, because the threat that required the vigilance is gone, and what remains underneath it all is the original thing, the intensity, the depth, the unusual capacity to care about things enough to feel them fully. The people who were told they were too much were never too much, they were too precise for imprecise containers. The world is full of environments that operate in a comfortable middle range of feeling, not too cold, not too warm. Not too curious, not too committed. Those environments aren't wrong. They work for a lot of people, but they're not the only environments that exist, and they are not the measure of authentic human experience. The people who got labeled as too much were built for something different, for depth over surface, for genuine caring over convenient approximation, for paying real attention in a world that often rewards the appearance of it. What changes things isn't becoming less, it's finding or building spaces that are large enough for who they actually are. So now I'm curious, were you someone who grew up feeling like you were too much, too emotional, too intense, too enthusiastic about things others seemed unbothered by? Or were you usually the calmer presence in the room, someone who watched others move through the world that way? Drop it in the comments. These are the kinds of questions that tend to bring out the most honest answers.